The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Chapter 1. The Story of the Door. It was a cold night in London. The full moon hung low over the city's rickety rooftops, and wisps of fog floated like ghosts through the squalid streets. Two men strolled side by side along a lamplit lane, their footsteps echoing around the old walls. Their names were Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield. They walked together every Sunday, but they rarely spoke. Until this night. "You see that door?" Enfield said, prodding his cane towards a dark doorway. "I know a strange story about that door." Utterson's bushy eyebrows rose in interest. "Go on," he urged. "It was a drizzly night last month." Enfield continued. "I was just leaving a tavern nearby when a man came charging over the copse. So fast he ran straight into a little girl coming from the other direction. The poor child screamed, but the fellow simply trampled over her and kept running." "Surely it was an accident," Utterson said. "Hardly," Enfield scoffed. "Utterson," the man laughed. "I hear it in my head even now, a terrible high-pitched cackle that sent a shiver down my spine." "What did you do?" Utterson asked. "Well, I set off after the man and tackled him. But when I saw his face, I wished I hadn't. His eyes were so dark, they were almost black, and his mouth was twisted into a sinister sneer. I swear he looked like the devil himself." "Come now, Enfield," Utterson laughed. "Surely you exaggerate?" "I am not sure that I do, Utterson. The very sight of this man made my stomach turn. Still, I composed myself and dragged him back to the scene of his crime. The girl was crying, and her family yelled for the police." "How did the fellow react to that?" The man's face broke into a vicious smile. He told them that he wished to avoid a scene and offered the family £100 to remain silent about the incident. "Did they accept?" Utterson asked. "They did. The sinister finger led us to this very house, where he produced the money and simply tossed it to the ground. Then he turned and slammed the door in our faces." Enfield and Utterson continued strolling through the gaslight. "I tell you, Utterson," Enfield said, "never in my life have I met such a fiend. I am still haunted by the memory of his ghoulish face and brutal manner." Utterson smiled at his friend's dramatic descriptions. "I shall be careful to avoid him," he replied. "Did he give you his name?" "He did. His name was Edward Hyde." Utterson's smile disappeared. "Hyde?" he said. "Are you quite sure? Does the name mean something to you?" "No," Utterson muttered. "It means nothing to me." But Utterson was lying. The name Edward Hyde haunted him too, but for a very different reason. Chapter 2. Search for Mr. Hyde. That evening, Utterson sat in his house beside a crackling fire, gazing at a document in his hand. Utterson was a lawyer, and this document was the will he had written for his close friend, Dr. Henry Jekyll. Its final line had occupied his thoughts for months, but never more so than tonight. "In the event of my death or disappearance, all of my possessions are to pass into the hands of Mr. Edward Hyde." Utterson had known Henry for most of his life, but had never heard the name Hyde before he read it in this will. And now, here Hyde was again. In Enfield's terrible tale, what hold did such a fiend have over poor Henry? If anyone knows, Utterson thought, it will be Lanyon. An hour later he arrived at the house of his friend, Hasty Lanyon, a red-faced doctor with sleeked silver hair. They sipped wine and spoke happily of old times. He and Lanyon were university friends, where they had both known Henry Jekyll. Did Henry ever mention a friend of his to you, Lanyon? Utterson asked. A man named Edward Hyde? Hyde? Lanyon said. No, never heard of him, but I have not spoken to Henry for almost a year. We might both be doctors, but he began to speak such unscientific balderdash that I feared he had lost his mind. Now, let us talk of a happier subject. But all Utterson could think of was that sinister name in Henry Jekyll's will. If he is Mr. Hyde, the lawyer decided, then I shall be Mr. Sick. From that night on, Utterson began to haunt the doll that Enfield had shown him. Before work in the morning and after work at night, he hid in an alley and waited for a glimpse of the mysterious fiend. At last, his patience was rewarded. Footsteps echoed along the foggy street. A hunched figure emerged from the gloom. Utterson stepped out, blocking the man's path. Mr. Hyde, I think, he said. The man shrank back with a hissing intake of breath. His face remained hidden under the shadow of his crooked top hat. How do you know me? He snapped. First, Utterson asked, will you let me see your face? Hyde hesitated and then stepped closer to the street lamp. Utterson shivered when he saw the man in the light. It was hard to say what was wrong with him, just that there was something evil about his face. A line of spit hung from his mouth as he kept grinding his rotten teeth. Now, Hyde snarled, tell me how you know me. Henry Jekyll gave me your address. At this, Hyde broke into a savage laugh. He barged past Utterson, knocking the lawyer to the ground. The door slammed behind him as he disappeared into the house. Utterson sat on the cobbles, trying to calm his hammering heart. Poor Henry, he thought. What can this devil have over him? Chapter 3. Visiting Dr. Jekyll. Utterson barely slept that night. The leering face of Edward Hyde haunted his dreams. He saw those burning eyes and that cruel, sneering smile. The bedroom rang with the man's mocking laugh. The following morning, he took a carriage to Henry Jekyll's house, a marble-stepped mansion with flowers hanging by the door. Inside, the doctor greeted Utterson with a friendly handshake and a beaming smile. As they ate breakfast together, Utterson studied his old friend. He was the same age as Utterson and Lanyon, but always seemed 10 years younger. He certainly didn't look like a man stalked by a sinister enemy. But Utterson had to be sure. I want to talk about that will of yours, he announced over coffee. Jekyll's smile vanished. I asked you never to speak of it, Utterson, he said. And I hoped not to, Utterson told him, except I have since heard more about this man, Edward Hyde. Henry, what I heard was abominable. I am aware that you met him, Jekyll said, and that he was uncivil to you. Uncivil? This man is a fiend, Henry, and yet you have left him your entire fortune in your will. Tell me what hold he has over you. Jekyll rose. The firelight cast his shadow long and monstrous across the wall. I cannot tell you, he said. All I can say is that I fear there will soon come a time when I am no longer here. In that case, promise me you will give everything I own to Edward Hyde. Help me, Addison, if not as my lawyer, then as my friend. How could Addison refuse? Picking up his hat and cane, he left the doctor alone. I can't pretend I shall ever like Hyde, he said as he went, but I promise. Chapter 4. An Inspector Calls. Addison agreed to let the issue of Hyde drop, but a few months later it thrust itself back into his life in a chilling manner. It was a blustery Wednesday night. When Addison was woken by a knock on his front door, he lit a candle and carried the flickering light to the entrance. A police inspector stood outside with a grim look on his face. Mr. Addison? He asked. I have a dark story to tell you. Addison lit a fire as the inspector sat down and began his tale. It began across London, the inspector said, as a maid-servant looked out of her window before she slept. She saw an elderly gentleman who had lost his way in the night. The maid was about to offer directions when another fellow came towards him, a man she describes as short and hunched. A shiver ran down Addison's spine. Go on, he said. Well, the inspector continued. All of a sudden, this fellow broke into a rage. He struck the old man to the ground and rained blows upon him with his cane. At the sight of such a terrible thing, the poor maid fainted. And the old man? He is dead. The inspector said, It is murder, Mr. Addison. The inspector reached into his coat pocket. He brought out the broken end of a walking cane. Do you recognize this? He asked. Addison did. It was a cane he gave to Henry Jekyll years ago. Inscribed on the handle was a message. To Henry from your friend, Gabriel Addison. So you see why I have come to you, the inspector said. This was the murderer's stick. Who is this man, Henry? It is Henry Jekyll. Then he is our killer. No, Addison insisted. Jekyll is a tall man. The maid described someone short. Inspector, I think I know the real name of the murderer. It is Edward Hyde, and I will gladly take you to his house. The hunt was on. The inspector marched behind Addison as the first glimmers of daylight lit the empty streets. Soon they arrived in that dismal district, and at that decrepit door, Hyde's door. The inspector pounded on it with his fist. Edward Hyde, he called, I demand to speak to you. No reply. The door creaked open on its rusty hinges. Addison stepped back, happy to let the inspector lead the way inside. It was morning outside, but the house was dark and dingy within. Drawers hung open and clothes lay strewn across the floor. Among them, Addison spotted shirts and jackets belonging to Henry Jekyll. So, Hyde is a thief as well as a murderer, he whispered. The inspector gestured for him to be quiet. As they crept deeper into the house, a fire crackled in the drawing room, but there was no one home. Looks like we have missed our man, Addison said. The inspector picked something up from the floor. It was the other half of Hyde's broken walking stick. He raised the evidence triumphantly. The murder weapon, he declared. We have Mr. Hyde now.
Chapter 5. The Incident of the Letter. It was late afternoon by the time Utterson arrived at Henry Jekyll's house. The doctor's butler, Poole, greeted him with a worried frown. "My master is in, sir," he said, "but he is in strange spirits." Poole led Utterson to a laboratory at the back of the house. Light fell dimly through a crack in the curtains, illuminating a clutter of test tubes, strange portions in jars and powders corked in bottles. Henry Jekyll sat slumped in an armchair. His eyes were red and his skin had turned deathly pale. "Have you heard the news about your friend Hyde?" Utterson asked. "The police are searching for him across London." Jekyll groaned in despair. "Utterson, I swear that I am done with Edward Hyde. Mark my words, that terrible man will never be heard from again. But there is one last thing." Jekyll held up a crumpled sheet of paper. The page trembled in his hand. "A messenger brought this letter today from Hyde," he said. "It says that he has run away and will never return. Do with it what you want, old friend. And what about your will, Henry? Should I remove Hyde's name from that document?" Jekyll stared up at the dusky light flickering between the curtains. Utterson saw a look of desperate sadness in his friend's eyes. "No," Jekyll said finally. "Leave the will as it is, just in case." With that, the doctor sank into his chair, covering his face with his hands. As he left the house, Utterson turned to the butler. "Poole," he asked, "there was a letter delivered today. Did you see what the messenger looked like?" Poole looked puzzled. "We have received no letters today, sir," he said. A dark thought entered Utterson's mind. He took Hyde's letter from his pocket and folded the bottom to conceal the sender's name. "Tell me, Poole," he asked, "do you recognize this handwriting?" Poole studied the page closely, and then nodded. "It looks different, sir, but I swear this letter was written by Dr. Jekyll." Utterson stumbled into the dusky streets, his mind reeling. Could it be possible? Could Henry Jekyll be covering for a murderer? Chapter 6. A Face at the Window. Time ran on, and the hunt for Edward Hyde continued all over London. Thousands of pounds were offered in reward, but he had no family, and no photographs had ever been taken of him. Those who had seen his face found that they could not really describe him, other than to agree that he was a detestable-looking man. As the weeks passed, Utterson thought less of Hyde and more of Henry, who had become a new man. The doctor invited Utterson and Lanyon for dinner, and the three friends talked and laughed about old times. It was as if a dark cloud had lifted from over him. Then, 2 months later, the cloud returned. It was a crisp January evening, and Utterson was on one of his walks through the city. He decided to pay Henry a visit. But when he reached the doctor's house, Poole wouldn't let him in. "My master is confined to the house today," the butler said. "Is he sick?" Utterson asked. "Sir," Poole said, his face darkening, "I cannot say what is wrong with him." Worried, Utterson marched around to the back of the house. He called to the laboratory window. "Henry, are you unwell?" A curtain rustled in the breeze. Moments later, Henry Jekyll appeared at the window. He looked like a prisoner in a dungeon, with pale skin and sunken eyes. "I am very low, Utterson," he said drearily. "You stay indoors too much," Utterson said. "Get your hat and come for a walk." Jekyll smiled sadly. "You are a good friend, Utterson," he said, "but I am afraid we can never meet again. From now on, I intend to remain confined to my house." "My dear chap, whatever for?" "I have brought upon myself a punishment I cannot name. Ask Lanyon. He will tell you." Before Utterson could reply, Jekyll gave a terrific cry. He gritted his teeth and bent over, as if fighting some terrible pain. But the pain was too much. The doctor collapsed back, clutching his stomach and crying out again. Utterson heard a table crash over and a glass smash. Then, suddenly, the window slammed shut. "Henry!" Utterson whispered. "What has become of you?" He rushed to Lanyon's house, but there, too, he found his friend unwell. Lanyon lay in bed, and the blanket pulled up to his chin. Each time a door creaked or a window rattled in the wind, the doctor's eyes darted around the room. It seemed as if the man's nerves had been shattered. "I have had a shock, Utterson," he said in a trembling voice, "from which I fear I shall never recover." "Henry is ill too," Utterson said. "Have you seen him?" A terrified whimper escaped Lanyon's lips. He sank deeper under his covers. "I wish to hear no more of Dr. Jekyll," he said, spitting the name like poison. "But Lanyon," Utterson protested, "we three are old friends. I fear that Henry needs our help." Lanyon gave a hollow laugh, which turned into a hacking cough. "Sit down, Utterson," he said, "and I will tell you a story about our friend Henry Jekyll, and the help that I have already given him." Utterson drew a chair closer as hasty Lanyon began his tale. Chapter 7. Dr. Lanyon's Tale. 4 days ago, Lanyon told Utterson, "I was sitting alone at home when a messenger brought a letter. It was from Henry Jekyll. Dear Hasty, I beg you to help me. Upon receipt of this letter, proceed directly to the laboratory in my house. Remove the top drawer from the desk and carry it back to your home. At midnight, a man will come to collect it. Give it to him and ask no questions. Please, Lanyon, do as I ask. My life depends upon it. Your friend, Henry." "A strange request," Utterson said. "Did you carry it out?" "How could I not?" Lanyon replied. "I took a carriage straight to Henry's house, where Poole let me into the laboratory. The room was in a terrible state, Utterson. There were test tubes smashed across the floor, powders and potions spilled over desks, and notebooks scribbled with the results of failed experiments. More and more, I feared that Henry Jekyll had lost his mind." "But you found the drawer he mentioned in his letter?" Utterson asked. "I did. It contained several jars of powder that looked like salt, that smelled unlike anything I have known. One sniff of the foul chemicals made me dizzy." "Did you bring the drawer back here?" as Henry asked. "I wish I had not, Utterson, for what happened next has left me a broken man. Go on." "This was obviously a secret matter," Lanyon said, "so I sent my servants to bed and awaited the arrival of Henry's mysterious visitor. The chimes of midnight had barely struck when there came a fierce knock on my door. A dwarfish figure stood silhouetted in the porch light. He seemed agitated, unable to stand still. "Have you got it?" The man snarled. "Won't you come inside first?" I asked. The man shuffled into the light. Utterson, he was a repugnant figure. He kept grinding his teeth and muttering furiously to himself. Utterson pulled his chair even closer to Lanyon's bed. "This man," he said, "sounds like Edward Hyde." "That was my fear too," replied Lanyon. "I wished then that I had not invited the ghastly individual into my house." "What did he do next?" Utterson asked. "He grew angry, Utterson." "Where is it?" he growled. "Where is the drawer? Tell me." "Compose yourself, sir," I told him. "The drawer is over there." The man sprang at it with a ferocious relish. A hideous grin spread across his face as he opened one of the jars of powder. "Yes," he said, hissing the word like a snake. "Now, give me a glass of water," he demanded. "You gave it to him?" Utterson asked. "I am not ashamed to say that I was scared, Utterson. I simply wanted the man gone. So I fetched him the water, and he poured the powder into the glass. The mixture bubbled and frothed. Vile-smelling fumes swirled into the air. Another evil smile spread across the man's face. "And now," Hyde said, "I suggest you leave." "Not a chance," I told the man, acting calmer than I felt. "I have gone too far in this not to see the end." The man grew angry, but he couldn't wait. He drank the revolting potion in one gulp. I have never seen anything like that. His face twisted with pain. His eyes rolled to the limits of their sockets. With a blood-curdling scream, he collapsed to the floor, where he lay curled up and moaning. Finally he rose, careful to keep his back to me, so I couldn't see his face. He seemed taller somehow, less agitated. "Are you well?" I asked him. Suddenly, he turned and barged past me for the door, but before he escaped into the night, I caught a glimpse of the man's face in the porch light. I, Lanyon scrunched his eyes shut, haunted by the memory. "What did you see?" Utterson asked. "What I saw, Utterson, was the face of Henry Jekyll." Chapter 8 The Last Night. Wind lashed at Utterson's face as he ran full pelt through the streets. Terrible thoughts raced through his mind. Could Lanyon's tale be true? Could Henry Jekyll and Edward Hyde really be the same person? No, he refused to believe it. Surely Lanyon had lost his mind as well, but he had to find out. He reached Henry's house and hammered on the door. Poole answered. A candle trembled in the butler's hand. His face was ghostly pale. "Mr. Utterson," he gasped, "I am so glad you are here. I fear that my master has been murdered." Tingling with fear, Utterson followed Poole into the house. He saw Jekyll's other servants covering together by the fire. Something diabolical had indeed happened here. More than ever, Utterson was determined to get to the bottom of it. Raising his shaky light, Poole led Utterson to Jekyll's laboratory. The door was locked, but Utterson heard someone moving inside. "You saw Dr. Jekyll go into this room?" he asked Poole. "As clear as day, sir," the butler replied. But soon after, I heard a piercing scream and the sound of smashing glass. Ever since, the door has been locked. "Jekyll?" Utterson called, banging on the door. "I demand to see you." "Go away," came the reply. "Please, Utterson, just go away." Utterson felt a shiver of terror. That wasn't Jekyll's voice, it was Hyde. "Stand back, Poole," Utterson demanded. "I'll smash my way in." Poole stepped back as the lawyer launched forward, smashing the laboratory door with his shoulder. Once, twice, 3 times. With each thunderous blow, the man heard another desperate cry from inside. "Please, Utterson, have mercy!" The door crashed open, and Utterson burst inside, his walking cane raised and ready to strike. But there was no need for the weapon. Lying on the floor in a twisted heap was the body of Edward Hyde. A bottle of red liquid rolled from the murderer's lifeless hand. "Poison," Utterson said. "The fiend took his own life." "Look, sir," Poole said, examining a sheet of paper on the desk. "A note from Dr. Jekyll. It is addressed to you." Utterson read the first line. "The confession of Henry Jekyll." Utterson stared at the corpse on the floor. Was Lyon telling the truth? Could this man be his friend Henry too? The letter trembled in his hand as he began to read. Chapter 9. The Confession of Henry Jekyll. My dear Utterson, now that my life reaches its end, the time has come to tell you everything about Henry Jekyll and Edward Hyde. Of me you already know much. I strive to be a kind man and a good doctor, but more and more I grew troubled by the violence I witnessed in my work, the wounds from guns, knives, and bloody battles. I became convinced that all men were not truly one, but truly two, good and evil. I was determined to find a way to separate the two characters. At night, I experimented with chemicals, creating a potion that I hoped would rid man of his capacity for evil. One night, I drank it. You have seen for yourself how the potion affected my body, Utterson, but you have not felt the indescribable pains. I felt a grinding in my bones, a sickness in my stomach. A terrible change came over me. When I finally looked in a mirror, it wasn't Henry Jekyll that I saw, but a hideous, grinning stranger. This man told me his name was Edward Hyde. I knew that Hyde was pure evil, so I quickly drank more of the potion, and again I became Henry Jekyll. It should have ended there, but I became fascinated with my creation. I drank the potion regularly, and I am ashamed to say that I welcomed the change. At night, I stalked the streets as Edward Hyde. I felt alive, Utterson. I felt truly alive. But gradually Hyde began to take control of me. I began to change into him without even taking the potion. Fearing he would consume me completely, I had you write that will, leaving everything I owed to Hyde. I even bought him his own house. Hyde's evil grew worse and worse. He barged into men, cursed at women, and trampled that young girl in the street. I knew I should put an end to him, but it was as if I was addicted to the dark side of his nature. Then, one night, Hyde went too far and murdered that poor man. Suddenly, all of London was hunting for Hyde. I began to take double and triple doses of the potion to stop myself from becoming him. I knew it might kill me, but I was desperate. For 3 months, it succeeded. As you will remember, Utterson, I became a new man. I was happy again, but it was not to last. One morning, as I walked in the park, I was racked by the pains of the change. A moment later, I was Hyde again. Hyde knew that he would be changed if he was caught, so he turned to Lyon to help secure the powder from my house. I am sure the doctor has told you what happened next, and that has led you now to my house. But it is too late to save me. I have run out of the powder that stops me from becoming Edward Hyde. Soon Hyde will take control of me forever. But before that can happen, I am resolved to take my own life with poison. I have created a monster, and now I must slay it. Yes, I feel him stirring inside me now. Goodbye then, Utterson. You were a true friend. Henry Jekyll. Sir, Poole said. Utterson flinched, crumpling the letter in his hands. He had been so lost in Jekyll's confession that he'd forgotten where he was. He turned, gazing at the monster Edward Hyde lying dead on the floor. This letter Utterson held would destroy Henry's reputation. He would be remembered as a monster. What had he once said? Help me, Utterson, if not as my lawyer, then as my friend. Utterson stepped to the fire and tossed Henry's confession onto the flames. Sparks crackled up the chimney as the shadows danced and darted around the laboratory walls. What about Dr. Jekyll, sir? Poole said. Henry Jekyll is gone, Poole, Utterson said. He will never be seen again. Then the lawyer turned and walked out into the night.